I'm currently in a predicament, and quite frankly, I don't know what to do. I'll start from the beginning. 5 years ago, my next-door neighbor, Charlie, or Charles, as we call him, informed us of his 14-year-old son's disappearance. He reported it to the police. It was on the news. It was everywhere. My wife and I felt absolutely awful and always offered to help them out in any way we could. As the years passed with no word of their son, we assumed they eventually came to terms with it and realized the worst had probably happened. My wife and I never had the nerve to ask if the body ever turned up. Occasionally, Charles and his wife would invite us over for a barbecue during the warmer months. We noticed neither of the two was ever the same since their son had gone missing. Charles's wife, Kathy, was always quieter and more reserved, and Charles just seemed more awkward and nervous, both understandable to a certain extent. Fast forward a couple of years to just last week. Charles came over to me while I was taking out the garbage and asked to borrow a shovel. Without hesitation, I ran to get him my best shovel, not asking why he needed it. He thanked me and said he just had to do some work in his backyard and would get it back to me by tomorrow. He then disappeared into his backyard. I went inside, and when I was by one of my upstairs windows, which has a clear view into Charles's backyard, I could see he was digging a really big hole. He seemed to be struggling a bit. He's 56, after all. I figured I'd grab my second shovel and help him out. As I entered his backyard and called his name, he looked up from what he was doing, dropped my shovel and hurried over to me, saying, "No, it's okay. I got it. Please, just leave." I asked him, "What's wrong with you?" It's not a big deal, mainly because of his bizarre reaction. He told me, "I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard," and then pointed to the gate as if I were a dog. I was so taken aback by how he was acting that I just left without saying another word. I went upstairs to spy on him through the window. He was digging the hole for at least another half-hour. When it finally looked like he was done, he started looking around, checking the neighboring houses as if to make sure nobody was watching. Before I could think to hide, he spotted me at my window. All I could do at that point was casually walk away. He's up to something, and I wanted to find out what. I continued to glance at his backyard every so often, but he wasn't digging anymore. I figured he knew I was watching and would wait until it was dark out, and I was exactly right. At 1:30 in the morning, I heard the sound of a shovel hitting the dirt outside. It was too dark to see anything from my window, so I snuck outside quietly and looked over the fence. I could see him digging, loud and clear now. When he went inside his house, I took that opportunity to sneak into his backyard and take a look at what was in the hole he was digging. The moonlight alone revealed a small piece of a black garbage bag protruding from the dirt at the bottom of the hole. I looked at his back door, then back at the hole. I did this 3 more times, debating whether or not to see what was in the bag. In the end, I decided to run back to my backyard, and it was a good thing I did, because he came back outside seconds later. But this time, he wasn't digging. He disappeared to the other side of his house and didn't come back. The next day, the first thing I did was look out my window and see that the hole in the ground was completely patched up in Charles's backyard. I also noticed that his SUV was parked on the street now instead of in his driveway. I don't know what happened throughout the rest of that night, but I'm disturbed to think that what was at the bottom of that hole might have been his son's body. For all I know, he dug up that hole to remove whatever he had previously buried and drove it somewhere else to dump it. This is all speculation. Call me crazy if you want. I haven't told anyone, not even my wife. And quite frankly, I don't know what to do. Charles never gave me back my shovel, and I'm not going to ask him for it. In fact, he's been avoiding me ever since. Something disturbing happened yesterday. By coincidence, I happened to look out my window across to Charlie's house and caught him standing at one of his windows, looking into mine. When he saw me, he shut his blinds, and that was in the middle of the day. I have no idea what to do, but I'm honestly terrified. I've lived in 3 houses in my life, 2 with my family and my current house by myself. We lived in the first house for the first 15 years of my life, and the second house for the next 7, before I moved out to my current home. This experience happened in my first home when I was 15, within the last few months of my family living in that house. I don't remember my family ever being really friendly with the neighbors. In fact, there were 2 kids living next door with their dad that my brother and I had only talked to once or twice in our entire lives. As bizarre as that sounds, we did know both of their names, though. Eric and Todd. One day, my brother, who's 5 years younger than me, and I were outside playing basketball on the driveway. That's when one of the 2 boys, Todd, came outside and walked over to us, initiating a conversation. I don't remember what we said to each other word for word, but I remember the first thing he asked us was if it was true that we were moving. As the older brother, I did most, if not all, of the talking. Todd was probably the same age as me, though I never actually asked. By the end of the conversation, he invited me to come with him and his brother to shoot BB guns by the river in the woods down the road the next day. I agreed, since it was the weekend, and I didn't have anything going on. My little brother asked if he could come at the last second, not under the assumption that he was automatically invited. Todd said, "Yeah," and then walked away. Late the next day, around an hour before dusk, Eric and Todd rang the doorbell. We were quick to answer because our parents didn't know that we were going out to shoot BB guns. Walking down the sidewalk with Todd and Eric decked out in camo gear and carrying a duffel bag of BB guns was really strange. The level of seriousness these 2 clearly had about this was really weird to me and my brother, and we kept meeting eyes, holding in our laughter a couple of times because of it. We got to the woods after having spoken very few words. I could already tell these 2 were kids of few words, which might be why we hadn't officially met them until that point. Todd dropped the duffel bag onto the ground and unzipped it, while Eric aggressively snapped a branch off a tree and threw it into the river. My brother and I looked at each other again, this time not finding it as funny. Todd pulled out a couple of guns and handed them to me and my brother, and that's when Todd dropped the bomb and told us they were real guns. Eric grabbed a loaded gun from the bag and began firing at trees across the river. When I realized he wasn't joking about the guns being real, I was a mix of anger and confusion. I grabbed the gun from my brother's hands and placed both of them back in the bag. I told them we weren't comfortable with this and had to leave. Eric stopped firing, and they both looked at us with expressions that seemed half angry. One of the 2 boys yelled a curse word at us as we were walking away. I'd always had a feeling these 2 were bad kids, but this confirmed it. I told my brother not to speak to them anymore for the remainder of our time living there. We told our parents at the dinner table that night that they were really weird kids, But we didn't mention the gun thing. That night, I woke up to a breeze of cold air hitting me in the face. My window was open all the way, and I felt something hard press up against the back of my head. I was looking out the window when I heard someone behind me go, "Shh." Somehow I didn't scream or jump. I just stayed calm. I quickly understood what was going on. I heard Todd's voice in a whisper behind my head. He told me if I ever told anybody, especially his dad, about the guns or the visit, he would come back and kill me and my entire family. I replied in a quiet, shaky voice, "Okay." He pushed my head with his gun before leaving through my window. Every night thereafter for months, I would catch either Todd or Eric at a certain window of their house, looking into either my or my brother's room. Their behavior became more and more strange as we got closer to the date of our move. Just a week before we moved, a rock was thrown at my window one night at around 1 a.m. I opened my window and saw Todd aiming a pistol at me from his backyard. I ducked down and closed my window before telling my dad. I heard the gun go off in the backyard, but luckily, I wasn't hit. Todd never came back into the house, though they continued to watch us from their window up until the day we moved. We never saw them again after that, and I didn't tell my parents until much later. My wife and I have lived in this house for 10 years, and until this day, I never had any problems with any of our neighbors. This neighborhood has been nothing but peaceful for as long as I can remember, and everyone living here is pleasant, except for one. There's a strange woman in her late 30s who lives 3 doors down from us. I don't know her real name, but I know everyone in the neighborhood calls her Crazy Nancy. I've seen Nancy a few times in the years we've lived here, but I've never interacted with her until recently. Most people in the neighborhood try to avoid her for the same reason. They say she suffers from a mental illness and is always on medication. We didn't think much of it. We're open-minded and respectful people. One evening, while I was taking out the garbage, Nancy walked over and started a conversation with me. I was polite and made small talk, but she was more than odd. She started telling me about how the government was after her and how they had put microphones in the trees. I just listened to her ramble, trying to get away from the conversation politely, but she wouldn't let me go. Finally, after about 10 minutes, I excused myself and went back inside. The next day, my wife told me that Nancy had come over while I was at work and asked to borrow our ladder. My wife, being as kind as she is, gave it to her. After that, Nancy would come over more and more often. She would ask for odd things, batteries, duct tape, even a loaf of bread. She was becoming a real nuisance, and my wife didn't know how to handle her, so we just kept being polite. One evening I came home to find Nancy sitting in my living room, talking to my wife. My wife told me she had let herself in and said she just wanted to chat. That was the last straw for me. I asked Nancy to leave, and she did, but not before giving me a very strange look. Later that night, we heard noises outside our house. I looked out the window and saw Nancy standing in our backyard, staring at the house. I went outside and told her to leave, and she walked away without saying a word. Over the next few nights, we kept hearing noises outside, and each time, Nancy was there, standing in the dark, staring at the house. We called the police, but they couldn't do anything because she wasn't technically breaking the law. They told us to get a restraining order, but we didn't want to escalate things. We thought maybe she would get the hint and stop. One night my wife woke me up, terrified. She said she heard footsteps in the house. I grabbed a baseball bat and went downstairs, only to find Nancy standing in our kitchen, holding a knife. She looked at me and said, "You don't deserve her." I yelled at her to leave, and luckily, she ran out of the house. We called the police again, and this time, they took her away. We found out that Nancy had stopped taking her medication and had a mental breakdown. She was put in a psychiatric hospital, and we haven't seen her since.